Maybe she'll come out of this. Like, maybe we'll be sitting here in 2030 being like, well, I didn't see her still being Prime Minister. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. Barney Scholes from the People's Vote campaign was our guest on today's show. Basically wanted to have a conversation about all of the different arguments surrounding the idea of a people's vote on the final Brexit deal. There's been a lot of different arguments about which way it should go, how the vote would be put out, and whether it's even either politically or logistically feasible. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes or on Spotify, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So here's Barney Scholes. So, Barney, thanks very much for agreeing to chat to me. It's a pleasure to be here in outrageously hot London. I'm just a boy from Northern Ireland. I cannot deal with this 28-degree heat.
Yeah. I mean, I'm from Liverpool originally, usually. I mean, this is just unbearably hot. I mean, although even for Londoner, like my fiance is born and raised in London, and I think even for her, it's just becoming unbearably hot. And like her ancestry is Middle Eastern, so when she's starting to struggle, it's getting really bad.
Yeah, that's not a good sign, is it? I know my cousins are from here, and they've all fled the capital in fear of heat. But let's get started. Pretty simply, why do you think we should have a people's vote on the final deal of the referendum or the Brexit negotiations?
Yeah, I think at this point it's becoming very clear that whether you voted Leave or Remain in 2016, that the process is going extremely badly. I think almost everyone agrees that the government is handling the negotiations very poorly, and increasing numbers of people are rightly concerned that the government's going to come back with a bad deal. So I think in those circumstances, it's it's the most democratic course to say, let's look at the actual Brexit deal that's on offer. What are the terms that the government is able to negotiate for our country? What will the future after Brexit look like? Will I be better off? Will I be worse off? Will my family be better off or worse off? How will my family in my area be affected? And to then make a decision on that basis about whether or not it's the right deal for the country. I think there's increasing momentum behind the idea. You see a lot of recent polling showing that support for the idea is growing, and most of the polls show that it's majority support in favour of having a people's vote on the final Brexit deal now, which is obviously for us very encouraging. But broadly, I think speaks to the fact that people are incredibly dissatisfied with the Brexit process. As I say, whether you're a Leave voter or Remain voter from 2016, I think that doesn't matter anymore. What we've got to look at is what the actual terms of Brexit look like. So I think on that basis, there's an increasingly democratic case to be made in favour.
Now, forgive me for being cynical here, but surely you could make this claim time and time again. So say we go to another vote on the deal that we come back with in October or whenever it gets agreed upon, and it gets put to the public, and we end up having what someone actually suggested. We might end up with an even more divisive referendum campaign if it's a second vote, with people becoming increasingly polarised. I don't know how we get to a worse position than we're in.
I think that's what I was going to say. That's always my feeling when we obviously people say that a lot. This kind of idea that wouldn't another referendum or another public vote be incredibly divisive? My initial reaction is, well, look at where we are now. Do you know what I mean? I don't think that it would certainly be very difficult to see how we become more divided as a country. And obviously, I don't think that's what anyone wants to see. But what we also know is that the consequences of a bad Brexit deal, or a Brexit deal that has serious negative implications for the economy, for jobs, for people's livelihoods, that those kind of seismic events in a country's history, and this would be a seismic event in the history of our country, can also have incredibly negative and divisive implications for years or generations to come. So I think my concern is making sure, and our concern as a campaign is making sure, that the terms on which Brexit is delivered actually match up to what the British people want. So we're not, in any way contesting the result of the first referendum, it's quite clear that although it was a small majority in favour of leave, the country did vote in favour of leaving the European Union. What that gave the government a mandate to do was then to go to the European Union and negotiate the terms of a Brexit deal. That's what they're doing at the moment. And as you know, as we started off this conversation by saying, they're clearly not doing a very good job of it, and almost everyone agrees about that. So, from that side of things, I think again it's perfectly legitimate to say to people, look, you voted for something in 2016. Here are the terms on which the government is proposing to deliver that thing that you voted for. Does that match up to what you expected it to look like? Does it accomplish the goals that you were looking for when you voted in 2016? And if not, it's perfectly legitimate for people to say, well, actually, you know, I've changed my mind since then. I think this idea that democracy somehow ended on 24th of June 2016, and that from that point onwards, no one is ever allowed to ever, you know, question the result of, or change their mind about such important events for our country ever again is just completely ridiculous. Anybody with a passing understanding of democracy can see that. It's the reason why we have general elections. You know, we don't vote for a government and then say, okay, well, we vote for that government once, so they now rule forever in perpetuity, no matter what. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say
we have one of those every year at this rate.
Well, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think as I said, I think there's a very strong democratic case to be made for it, and that's part of the reason why the momentum is building behind it, and why more and more people are calling for one.
How would you try and put what you said there onto a ballot? This is where I find the most tricky part, because there was a big debate lead up to the first referendum, where there was a lot of debate over, you know, the wording of the question.
Yeah.
I believe Aaron Banks's firm had a whole lot of branded merchandise done that had that was in the know, because it was going to be an in or out on the ballot paper as opposed to leave or remain.
Yeah.
And like even that tiny difference was debated and argued over. Do you really think that we'd get to a point where we can say, okay, this is exactly the question that we're going to put on the ballot paper, and if we're able to get a majority to support the idea in the first place, then to have to get them to all agree upon the terms of another vote? Like, what do you see?
Yeah.
Like, do you foresee problems there? What do you see as being the solutions?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ideas that are sort of floating around about it. I mean, our preference as a campaign, as the People's Vote campaign, is for any vote to be a choice between the deal that the government is offering, as in the deal that they've negotiated with the European Union, and remaining in the EU. We think that's a pretty clear choice between, as I say, the fact that the people voted to leave in 2016, the government has gone away and attempted to negotiate a Brexit deal that delivers on the vote of the British people, and then to put that to a choice, you know, straight choice to people to say, here's the deal that the government's negotiated on your behalf, or you can choose to remain in the EU. So that's our preference as a campaign. However, there are other ideas floating around out there. You know, Justine Greening talked about the idea of a three-way choice between deal on offer, remaining in the EU, or no deal. Ultimately, it is going to have to be for Parliament to decide whatever the question is, and I don't want to sort of prejudge that. But one thing I would say is that I think it would be the height of irresponsibility for any government and any elected representative of the people to put a no-deal choice on the ballot paper, because I think that despite all of the attempted government spin about no deal being better than a bad deal, which they've started to drop increasingly as it becomes obvious just how disastrous.
I feel like that's been mentioned more in the last month.
Well, what they're I mean, I think there's a clear attempt to kind of ramp up the rhetoric around no deal at the moment, but you quite rarely hear Theresa May anymore using that specific slogan of no deal is better than a bad deal. I did some studies on it actually to kind of show the evolution of it, because it was something that she said a lot at the beginning of the of this process, and then something that she drifted away from saying very much at all.
I don't think I've really heard her personally use it post general election.
Exactly, yeah. So that was sort of the turning point for that. That you can, if you do a kind of a study of like when she's actually used that phrase, that's when you see it sort of disappear from her lexicon. But I think part of the reason for that is that they're not fooling anybody with this, with the no deal rhetoric. Like both the EU and the country, I think, can see that that both that no deal would be a disaster, and that although it would obviously be very, very bad for everybody, so bad for the EU side as well, it would be a catastrophe for the UK because we're not prepared for it. We haven't put any of the systems or infrastructure in place that you would need to deal with the consequences of it. It would be a complete betrayal, actually, of millions of people living, either EU citizens living in the UK or UK citizens living in the EU, who would have their rights completely thrown up in the air with no idea where they're going to come down, what their futures hold. So I think that's, although it's kind of floated as an option, my own view on it and our view on it as a campaign is that to even contemplate the idea of no deal is just basically incredibly dangerous. It's sort of like saying, unless you give me exactly what I want, I'll shoot you in the foot and myself in the face. It's not tenable as an option, and it's not the best thing for the country. And the other thing is, it's certainly not what I don't think anyone actually voted for in 2016, whether you voted Leave or Remain. Actually, if you go back and look at the pitch that Vote Leave was making to people during the referendum, all of it was built around the idea that we'd be able to negotiate a better deal with the EU than the one we have now. So some kind of, it was very unclear what exactly form that would take. I'm sure something that we'll probably discuss. But, whether it would be a free trade deal or whether it would be sort of remaining in part of the single market or whatever it might be. But what was clear was they never had a no-deal Brexit as a realistic option on the table. I don't think anybody going into that referendum campaign thought that when they were voting if they voted for Leave, that they were voting for a no-deal outcome. So there's an increasing attempt by someone to sort of describe them as the kind of Brextremist wing of the...
Brextremist. That's a great term.
I have to give my boss James McGrory credit for that one. There's an increasing attempt by some of the Brextremists to kind of paint this as the best outcome. They often talk about it now as like the WTO option, or sometimes they call it like the global Britain option. They've tried to dance around a lot of different terms to make it sound more palatable to people. But the reality of it is it would mean walking away from every single trade agreement that we've, been part of over the last 40 years or so. It would mean tearing up all kinds of arrangements on security cooperation with the EU. It would mean overnight losing our access to policing and security databases that police forces rely on. I mean, there's a thing in the news today about police chiefs warning that a no-deal outcome would have incredibly serious consequences for their operational capacity. And there are thousands of these examples. Like I've listed like 3 there, but every single day there's new ones. I mean, everybody can see it. People read about it all the time. Flights, medical supplies, food supplies.
I think that's the one that really terrifies people.
What?
No, not the food supplies, the medical supplies, the actual serious stuff.
Yeah. Well,
we might not be able to get our avocados.
Yeah, it doesn't go down well in
someone
Shoreditch.
Please think of the guac.
I mean, personally, I'm a big fan of the nacho, so going without guac would be difficult. But no, I mean, the medical supplies situation is a serious issue. There's numerous NHS experts and professionals have warned about this. I know Sarah Wollaston, who's a Conservative MP, who's also the chair of the Health Select Committee and the support of the People's Vote campaign, has been very, very vocal about this. And she should know because she spends most of her time focused on.
We'd like to think so on the Health Select Committee.
Yeah, absolutely. But things like insulin supplies, we don't really make them in this country. We import them for the vast majority of them. There's obviously talk about the isotopes that are used in cancer treatments. Again, they've got a very short shelf life and they're transported. So there are all kinds of issues. And as I said before, there are literally thousands of these things that affect every single part of people's day-to-day lives. And for any government to countenance jumping off the cliff in that way, I think is just, as I said, the height of irresponsibility and not something not something that they should consider, and also something that wouldn't easily be forgotten, I don't think.
Yeah, a lot of people have blamed the media for not portraying the dangers of no deal. But part of me feels like it was because they just didn't believe it was a genuine possibility until sort of fairly recently. But you said something about that people believe, or people know, that no deal isn't a sensible option. That's not realistic. I would push back on that quite significantly. The YouGov polling that was done on that three option referendum vote that Justine Greening proposed basically found that there was about 8% support for the deal, sort of leaving with the deal.
It's in the sort of Chequers.
Yeah, is in that sort of thing. Now, that could be just because people hate the Chequers deal, but it left about 40% of people in favour of leaving with no deal. And that to me is fucking terrifying. And then they did sort of modelling on what the two runoffs would be. So it was either Remain versus the Chequers deal.
And then it was something, I think it was like 59% Remain. Or something like that.
I think it was 53% Remain, 47% no deal.
Right.
As opposed, yeah. That's madness.
I mean, I think you're right to a certain extent that that maybe the public consciousness around what the real world implications of no deal would be aren't quite there yet. And I think that's that's understandable, because it's not always that easy, I should say, to kind of process these things necessarily, because it's something that's it's in the future, and it's quite easy, I think, and partly that's because of the way that it's responded to by people on the extreme pro-Brexit wing, who kind of just dismiss all of this stuff as like Project Fear, Mark II, or whatever, even when it comes from. I mean, the thing is, they don't seem to trust warnings from major businesses. They've said Airbus are basically funded by the EU, therefore that's why they're warning about these things. They don't seem to trust warnings from police chiefs. They don't trust warnings from unions. They don't trust warnings from major business. Anybody, as far as I can tell. So I'm quite interested to find out who. Who would they be? I don't. I mean, unless maybe if Aaron Banks says it, then that must be gospel or something. I'm not quite sure, but it certainly seems to be the case that
from behind his bars in a South African jail.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm not prejudicing the future trial of Aaron Banks in any way.
No. Well, I think he kind of set anyone who was on the fence against him when he suggested that the Channel 4 team who investigated needed their sanity examined and questioned their mental capacity of the production team who sanctioned the reporting. That's I really don't like that sort of attack on the press, but Banks is an interesting character.
But sort of on the no deal stuff, I think that's part of it. But I think the other side of that is that I think that part of the reason why there has been more of a shift towards the idea of having a people's vote on the final Brexit deal, which all the polling suggests that there is partly a result of the idea that no deal is becoming more and more is kind of looming ever greater on the horizon to a certain extent. So, and I think that's kind of a trap of the government's own creation, interestingly, and something that they've sort of walked themselves into, because it's quite transparent that Theresa May's strategy at the moment is to talk up, in a sense, the kind of risks around no deal, in the hope that will drive people towards her proposal for how the Chequers proposal for Brexit. That's, first of all, not working because people hate the Chequers proposal, as you said. 8% of
something like that. I can't remember the exact figure.
Most of every poll that you look at shows that it's quite wildly unpopular.
Yeah. I think 78% of people believe that the government are doing a bad job with negotiations, which is the most united I have seen the country on anything.
Well, it's good to know Theresa May can sort of unite people over one thing, and that one thing is that she's terrible at it.
Maybe she'll come out of this. Maybe we'll be sitting here in 2030 being like, well, I didn't see her still being Prime Minister. Jive about her being, was it like the zombie Prime Minister, sort of stuck around for a long time. I do sort of
admire her resilience in a certain way, because I don't think many people predicted that she'd still be here at this stage. Certainly not after the snap general election result.
No, but
But I think part of the reason for that is because Brexit is such an undeliverable. It's basically undeliverable in the form that it was promised to people, and part of the kind of centrifugal force that has created has kind of held her in place, because there's clearly no majority in Parliament at this stage for any form of Brexit. So the kind of mechanics of that within Parliament means that she's sort of held in place because there's not really any other option for anyone to turn to at this stage. So I think that's sort of done her a favour in some ways, because there's one thing being resilient, but I don't think anybody could argue that she seems to be in control of events. It's more like they kind of just roll from one catastrophe to another and somehow rebound onto the next one, and that just keeps them bouncing forwards.
Yeah. And
I mean, I think that's also part of a sort of broader thing about we live in such kind of crazy times at the minute, and the news agenda just moves so quickly. It's part of it. This is a little bit of a side issue, but sort of fascinated by American politics generally, but with Trump, one of the fascinating things is how quickly scandals that would for any other politician possibly be kind of impeachment level stuff, or at least would be much more serious than they are, and they end up being, and that's just because of the sheer volume of stuff that comes out. And Brexit is quite similar to that in a way, that it's just the sheer volume of stories around it and the sheer noise content that it creates. Just means that it's very hard for any one specific thing to cut through. I do think no deal is one of the things that is cutting through a bit more, because it affects so much of sort of people's everyday lives.
I think everyone can take their own life and apply some way in which no deal is going to affect them.
Yeah, and that's, that whether that be linked to, they're saying that medical supplies might be disrupted. What does that mean for
grandmother?
My grandma's cancer treatment, or whatever it might be, or whether it's people talking about deploying the arm. There's talk of them maybe deploying the military to kind of supply food to Cornwall or whatever. Which we laugh about it, but it seems to be something that has at least been proposed at some level of government.
Well, there are government plans for surviving a zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Although I saw something on Twitter the other day that was there was something like, if your Brexit plans are similar to your survival plans for a zombie apocalypse, maybe you're doing something wrong, which I thought it kind of resonated.
I saw someone about a month or two ago suggesting that they were going to start stockpiling some stuff just in case, and it was just on Reddit, and like he just got abused beyond belief. And I showed it to my friend who helps me run the Gist, and he was like, "Oh, don't be stupid." And about a month later, I turned and went, "You still think it's such a stupid idea to start stocking stuff up?" Because he was like, "We might run out of coffee," and I was like,
Now is the time to start buying lots of tinned goods.
Yeah.
I do have the sort of World War II era bunker in my garden. It's going to be put to good use.
Well, hopefully war doesn't break out. But interestingly, something that I talked about yesterday with Christine Jarding of the Liberal Democrats, she was that. Do you know what the largest country in the world that trades solely on World Trade Organization terms is?
I don't think there are any, are there?
There are like some really, really tiny ones that is essentially World Trade Organization rules. Yeah. And the largest one that I can find is Mauritania, that's whose economy is 500 times smaller than the UK, and some of the population still live in a form of quasi-slavery. So,
sounds like an ideal model for post-Brexit
that's
Britain.
The Britain we want.
Global Britain. Hooray.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that, like, it's sort of touched on it before with this idea that the WTO, they call it the WTO option, the no deal option, is increasingly being pushed by some of the more sort of fanatical pro-Brexiters, and they kind of talk about it as if it's a sort of safety net that's going to save us all from the sort of disaster that they're increasingly attempting to inflict upon everybody.
Well, the IEA described it as a clean break.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it's just nonsense, because as you've just described, there are basically there's certainly no developed economies that trade only on WTO terms. For example, the US, although it doesn't have a trade deal in place with the EU, has a whole range of.
Well, they've just signed it.
What's that?
They've just signed the trade deal with the EU, the US.
Have they?
As far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I must have missed that one.
That was like a week or two ago.
I must have missed that one on the breaking news bulletins, yeah.
There's a lot happening. Or maybe it wasn't signed, but the terms were definitely finalised from what I remember. I'm going to have to check that. But
yeah. Well, I think that, like say, I think the US has hundreds of kind of sectoral agreements that link into the EU, that allow them not to be trading on. I mean, WTO terms is literally like a complete bare bones structure by which you can sort of facilitate some degree. It's basically an international attempt to facilitate trade in the most basic way. It's certainly not a safety net of any kind of strength or durability. Like, you speak to anybody who's actually worked either for the WTO or in relation to the WTO, they'll tell you that. They'll tell you that there are lots of kind of friendly sounding words in the WTO agreements that Brexiters like to bring up a lot, sort of trade facilitation measures and things like that. But what those things actually mean in practice is something else entirely. They kind of they first of all rely on the WTO dispute resolution mechanisms and adjudication methods to actually operate in any way. And that's something that at the moment is very much under threat from an increasingly protectionist America. But also, they don't facilitate anything. Like, for example, they don't really have any provisions at all on services, for example. Services is 80% of the UK economy. So the idea
80%?
Yeah.
Whoa.
The idea that we're going to sort of fall back on these things as some kind of safety net is just ridiculous, and something that I think it's transparent why certain Brexiters are pushing this angle. It's because they see it as a way of kind of completely reshaping the UK economy in a way that they certainly don't have a mandate to do from the referendum, and they're very hard to argue that they have any kind of mandate to restructure the UK economy in that way. So yeah, I think the WTO option is ridiculous, and the fact that it's being talked up so much is an active danger.
It's quite. I don't know what happened. I think a lot of, and I'm planning to quiz the IEA personally on this. I'm talking to their chief economist tomorrow, and I think
Singham, is it?
It's not. I almost had Shankar Singham.
So close.
So
the dream.
That would have been amazing. But then I don't know if he would agree to do it, because I've criticised him quite openly for conflicts of interest and cash for access things with the IEA to Liam Fox, Michael Gove, that sort of thing. So, right. So I don't know how willing he would have been to talk to me, and I couldn't have gone in and not mentioned that. So
not in his good books.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah. Just to go back there quickly. Trump has claimed that the deal has been agreed,
right?
But there's been no concrete stuff. So.
Well, I mean, Trump claims a lot of things. So if you want to put a lot of stall in, things that Donald Trump says, then good luck to you. But I'm certainly not going to do so.
Yeah. Well, there's more honesty in what he says than I think people give him credit for, because the things he says consistently, he believes in. Yeah. It's everything else you just have to ignore, because he's there to work on.
That's actually true. Actually, as you say, that there are certain core principles that he seems to never be willing to sort of breach.
The wall.
Putin is a great guy, and things like that. There's other things where he's slightly more changeable.
Well, I think that the thing is that he's the last person he's spoken to you'll agree with on most topics.
Often say, isn't it? So, I assume he gave that press conference after
talking to Jean-Claude Juncker. Yeah, probably.
Dripping honey in his ear.
Yeah, maybe. But sorry, to get back to Brexit a little bit. We talked about how there's no majority in Parliament for any sort of Brexit. Now, do you really think it's possible to build a cross-party coalition of majority support for a people's vote? Because from what I can tell, it would have to be an act of Parliament to authorise a second referendum.
Yeah. I mean, there are different ways to kind of get to that point, but you're right that the most kind of overwhelmingly sort of realistic and likely method is through an act.
Yeah, like you could go down the route of attempting to have the last referendum struck off but then you're changing then that's basing the new referendum on the fact that the old one was struck off. I don't think
I think you're kind of, as you say, you're kind of getting into a bit of a minefield there. I think you're right. The most obvious way is for it to be an act of parliament. I think yes is the answer to your question. I can see building a majority in parliament.
Where do you see most of the votes coming from? The Labour Party?
I mean, the Labour Party is going to have to come on board with this if we're going to be successful in that game. I think that's obvious. But yeah, I mean, part of our campaign is obviously focused on winning over the Labour Party. We're having increasing success with that, I think.
Well, Tom Watson and Keir Starmer both
very
consistently
much left the door wide open to it. And I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's never explicitly ruled it out. He's quite careful with his language around it, so he'll never.
I find it interesting that Brexit is the thing he tiptoes around. There's no he doesn't tiptoe around anything else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair to him and to the sort of leadership of the Labour Party, it is a difficult issue for them because, I mean, as it is for all political parties, you know, the sort of fractures that Brexit has opened up aren't exclusive to the Labour Party and not exclusive to the Conservative Party. They go across society. But it is a difficult issue for the Labour Party because they have an overwhelmingly pro-European membership and supporter base. So I think most polls show that somewhere in the region of 70% of Labour voters were Remain voters. But they also have a large number of constituencies that are in, you know, areas that voted to leave around the northeast, places like that, Midlands.
Midlands is actually more underfunded than the north.
Yeah,
it's something I found out recently. I was shocked.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was an interesting study recently that linked, the impact of austerity to areas that vote whether they voted leave. There's a quite clear correlation between the impact of austerity and areas that voted to leave. I mean, I think there's probably more work that needs to be done because it's too complicated. I think to kind of people like to sort of have these things as like, oh, that caused that directly, and that's the only thing.
Well, it's like to go back to America. It's like arguing that the James Comey reopening the email investigation 8 days before the election was the thing that won Donald Trump the election, which may be true, but there was also a lot of other stuff involved there.
Exactly. I just think, I'm not naive about this stuff. We live in a complicated world, and these things always have multiple factors. And I think that part of the way that we like to think about things is to try and sort of dilute them down into one single reason, one single causal factor, because it's just easier for people. Hard to do that with anything, but it's especially hard to do it with huge things like Brexit. Or I think it's a bit reductive to attempt to do so. But yeah, coming back to the broader point, it is a difficult issue for the Labour Party. Having said that, when you do polls of Labour Party members and supporters, you find, again, overwhelming support for the idea of a people's vote on the final Brexit deal, again, ranging in the 70-75% area.
Yeah, I think 70% are pro-Remain from just polling I've seen off the top of my head.
So it is something, if the leadership was to ask the membership of their own party about it, the answer would be a resounding yes, we want people's vote on Brexit. And as I said, you are seeing increasing movement on this. I think, with certain unions that support both the Labour Party and Labour Party leadership that are now on board with the idea of people's vote. So the TSSA are now in support of one. That's the union led by Manny Cortez, who's very close to the Labour leader's office. Prospect is another union that's backed it. Unite, although they haven't explicitly supported people's vote, they did pass a motion at their conference recently that very much again left the door open to the idea that they could support one in the future. So there's real movement there. You're seeing, as you said, there's a big chunk of the Labour Party in terms of parliamentary Labour Party that's already in favour of this, and more joining all the time. There's a movement at the grassroots level to get constituency Labour parties to pass motions in support of a people's vote ahead of obviously the party conference in September. There's a petition doing the rounds within Momentum. So basically, if you get 10% of Momentum's membership sign up to a specific petition, they are required to debate that as a at a national level.
Momentum or the Labour Party?
Momentum.
Okay.
And I think they, as far as I'm aware, they passed that threshold now on the petition calling for a people's vote. So Momentum will presumably be having a debate on this very shortly at the national level to decide whether or not they support the idea of a people's vote. There's all kinds of news articles recently about the increasing degree to which this is being heard within the kind of corridors of power in the Labour Party, and the fact that it's not going to be sustainable for them to kind of dodge this issue. Last year at the conference, there was quite a concerted effort to avoid talking about Brexit much in a substantial way.
I always push back on this narrative because I read a couple of really lengthy, in-depth pieces from people who covered the conference last year. And it wasn't so much that Brexit wasn't on the table. There was like a full half a day dedicated to it. Yeah. It was more that people wanted to talk about other stuff.
That's totally fair enough. I think that I'm not saying that this should be the only thing that the Labour Party is talking about. They're a national party that have issues. There are other things that they obviously want to and are entitled to be discussing. But when such a large portion of your own membership and your own supporters are in favour of this specific thing, I think it's not sustainable for the party to not respond to that and to kind of not ignore the issue. I'm not saying that they're ignoring the issue of Brexit, but like you said earlier, it's one of the few issues that Jeremy Corbyn tends to sort of dance around a little bit without ever, there's a lot of talk about jobs first Brexit. There is kind of very small differences.
I think the EU described their plan as cake just as much as they described Chequers as cake. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, to be fair, I think that's right. Like, there's a lot of kind of crosstalk in the Labour Party, even within the leadership about what exactly it is that their Brexit position is. If you ask, for example, if you ask Keir Starmer what their position is,
he'll roll out his 6 tests.
Yeah, you'll get a very different answer than if you ask, for example, Barry Gardiner, who's their shadow international trade secretary, who famously described one of the 6 tests as bollocks in a meeting that was leaked. But like, for example, on the customs union thing, like that's the thing that Labour likes to say, oh, well, this is our real point of difference from the Conservatives on Brexit. They want to leave the single market and the customs union. We also want to leave the single market, but we want to form a new customs union.
Yeah, very important word.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But if you ask Keir Starmer about that, what does that mean? What's the difference between a customs union and the customs union that exists at the moment? He'll give you quite a reasonably straight answer that they call it a customs union because you have to leave the treaties of the European Union, therefore it can't be called the customs union. But in practice, it would be the same. He says it would do the lifting of the customs union. I want to get into a debate around semantics, but he's quite clear that to all intents and purposes, it would look the same as the arrangements we have now. Whereas if you talk to Barry Gardiner about what that means, he describes something quite different, which is a kind of a looser arrangement, closer to something, the kind of customs union that some South American countries have with each other, and that would allow, and also that would allow the UK to negotiate its own trade deals independently of the EU, which is just as dead on arrival as a proposal as the government's Chequers proposal is, or any other mad thing that they've put forward over the last 2 years. So there's 2 points there. One is that the overwhelming body of opinion within the Labour Party, both within the PLP and within the membership and supporter group, is both pro-European and in favour of people's vote on the final deal. And the second point is that it's worked reasonably well up until a certain point for Labour to remain quite ambiguous about what their Brexit policy is, with people saying different things and that being left open to interpretation, because it's allowed them to kind of walk the tightrope, if you like. But that's not sustainable when it really comes down to the crunch. When it comes time to actually decide which side of this you're on. When the government, if they come back with a deal, if they're able to negotiate something that they can put before Parliament, which is by far from a sure thing. But at that point, the Labour Party is going to have to make its mind up about where it stands on all of this. And our view on it is that they should be in line with what their membership and their supporters want, which is that they should be voting in favour of other people's vote on the deal.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to watch the Labour conference this year. I think there's probably going to be a lot more push for a policy change from the party. I think the term is that it will be, they can put forward a vote on any policy that the party is promoting and have it referenced back to the National Council to rethink it.
Yeah.
So I think we could see momentum really push for that sort of policy, for their Brexit policy essentially to be referred back, or for them to maybe more wholeheartedly endorse a people's vote. I think
it'll certainly be kind of something. I think that it's clear that the main thing that comes out of Labour Party conference, I think, if anything, is move on their Brexit position. It might be a substantial move, it might not be, but I think there's going to be some kind of shift. I think it seems increasingly inevitable. And, to be fair, their conference, at the moment, it kind of looks like their Conservative Party conference is going to be the real bloodbath in terms of,
we thought that last year.
Yeah, that's true.
No one wants her job. This, right? Everyone keeps feeling like she's gonna go, and I was kind of inclined to believe them for quite a while.
I know,
but she's hanging on.
I'm the same.
Nobody wants her. Yeah. No one wants her job.
I need to stop making these predictions because I'm always wrong. But yeah, no.
To be fair, I was also, I didn't think she would last very long.
Yeah.
I'm less skeptical about how long I'm more skeptical about how long she will last than how long the Conservatives will stay in government, because I still think they will cling on even if she resigns. I don't think they'll call an election unless there's, I don't know, well, you never know what's going to happen now. Yeah. But
don't make predictions anymore. It's a mugs game.
Oh well, I've got two big bets on that. I think I might get at least one of them. Yeah. But for any polling company that's listening, I would really love to know if you give Labour Party members an option between stopping Brexit or stopping austerity. I would love to see what the results would be there, because I really have no idea.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I think the argument that we're making, and that I think you're increasingly seeing from sort of really influential people within the Labour Party, is that can't stop austerity and proceed with Labour's current position on Brexit. So if you crash out of the single market and the customs union, if you tear up all of the kind of trade links that we have with our biggest trading partner, the European Union, as well as potentially tearing up all of the trade agreements that have been negotiated internationally, whilst we were part of the EU, the damage that will do to our economy, it will mean that austerity will continue kind of for the foreseeable future, basically. Or every single economic, I should say reputable economic analysis, because there's always kind of economists for free trade, or Patrick Minford's crew, who are always willing to kind of tell you that actually everyone who tells you Brexit's going to be a disaster is wrong. But he's like literally a minority of one, really, amongst serious economists. But every single, all the reputable evidence tells us that that this kind of Brexit, in which we crash out of the single market and the customs union, is going to have incredibly severe consequences for the economy on a scale that might not have seen before. And that especially goes for areas that have, like we were talking about before, areas that have suffered from years of austerity. Places like the Midlands, places like the Northeast, places like, I'm from Liverpool originally. I mean, it's a slightly a personal digression, but Liverpool as a city, without European Union funding, would be in incredible amounts of trouble right now. I mean, it's local council budgets already massively in trouble across the country, but like Liverpool as a city, it's arguable whether it certainly wouldn't have survived in its current form without the levels of European Union funding that it's had, which is part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this. But those areas that have really suffered, those areas outside of London, the North and the Midlands and elsewhere, that have been hammered by years of austerity, years of cut budgets, they're going to feel the effects of Brexit worse than anywhere else. There's studies that show that although London would certainly take a hit from Brexit, it wouldn't be in any way immune from it. The hit they would take would be much less than like the Northeast, which they're talking could potentially lose like 11 to 16% of its GDP, which for an area like the Northeast, which already struggles,
Northern Ireland's looking at similar figures.
Yeah, exactly. It's crippling. Like, we have one of our MPs who does a lot for us is Phil Wilson, who's the MP for Sedgefield in the Northeast, and he talks about it in the same. It would have a comparable hit to when they closed the pits, which is still talked of as a kind of generational tipping point in the history of that region. This could easily be something that either is similar in scale or potentially even dwarfs that in scale. And I won't say that to kind of scare people or sort of talk down the country or whatever it is that we're accused of doing. But this is real people's lives and jobs and communities and industries and livelihoods and families. And I think it's too easy to kind of forget all of that in the kind of inside the Beltway, Westminster bubble. Who's going to take over from Theresa May? I mean, people obviously do care about that, but they care less about that than they care about their community not being absolutely hammered by massive spending cuts or, having to close down, companies pulling out of the region because they can't, it doesn't make economic sense for them to be there anymore. So, yeah, I kind of have quite a visceral reaction to this sort of what I view as a kind of disaster capitalist shock doctrine approach to Brexit, which seems to be the preferred angle, like sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg, like that. I think that's why I'm kind of so viscerally opposed to that they want to take this country down.
I kind of feel bad for him occasionally because he's getting a lot of abuse for his hedge fund moving to Ireland. Like, he has no say in that. Yeah. Zero whatsoever. So like he's just right to be like, well, this is my decision. Yeah. Like, but
I think I think the point is that people look at it and
I get why people are. I just find it. I just kind of feel bad. I think
it's also because it's part of a pattern as well. Like you have Lord Lawson, who's one of the most vocal proponents of Brexit, claiming French citizenship. John Redwood, again, an incredibly vocal pro-Brexit MP, advising firms not to invest in the UK. And there's a whole pattern of these things. And I think people, people can just people can smell the hypocrisy of it. It's not going to be those people that feel the hit from Brexit.
No,
they're rich enough that that they'll be insulated from it. But
just for the record, I'm not endorsing anything Jacob Rees-Mogg says on any issue.
I think he's too late now.
I think I'm probably getting doxed by hard lefties, if you believe that's what they do and spend all their day doing. But just to sort of come to a conclusion here, the last thing I kind of wanted to ask you about was something we sort of began with, but in the Brexit Club, Owen Bennett sort of talks about the surprise that Conservative members of Parliament and UKIP campaigners were all having on June 22nd or June 23rd. I can't even remember. Which day was the referendum itself? The 23rd? Okay, it's 24th was the results day.
Into my brain, clearly.
I couldn't remember if the 23rd was the day we found out or the day we did the vote. But
sorry. So, 23rd. 23rd was the...
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that was the Saturday.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Something like that. Anyway, that they were absolutely shocked because they saw that the government had extended the registration period for voters by 48 hours, and they got massive numbers of voter registration, and they all expected this to be like, the students and the prawn sandwich brigades and the people, the sort of garden centre liberals coming out and actually voting for the first time in ages. But it turned out that a lot of this was where people were at council estates in their constituency, and like where they would normally register 30-40% just because of complete political apathy. And they were queuing down the street. There was like 80-90% turnout in some like housing estates, and they felt that they'd somehow managed to tap into this group of people who had never been engaged in politics before, who had never like even considered that even the idea of registering to vote, let alone like voting in a referendum or an election. And there's a huge risk, and I think this is a big risk. Like, as much as I'm pro people's vote, like, do you risk alienating that entire group of people who came out for the first time and went, look, this is what we want, and we haven't ever come up and said and spoken up for ourselves, or voted, or tried to engage with like what's going on in politics, or in Westminster, or even just like local issues, that these people have gone, you know what, this is something like I passionately believe in enough to go and vote for it, and now it's being taken away from me. Like, how do you deal with that sort of feeling of resentment?
I think first of all, I'm not in the business of sort of patronising anybody or suggesting why people voted the way they did. I think millions of people voted in good faith the way that they felt, the way that they wanted the country to go, and they went into the ballot box, as you rightly say. Lots of them voted before and made a choice about the direction they wanted the country to go. And I don't think it's right of anybody to make any assertions about why they made that decision. It's important, obviously, as a kind of matter of historical record, to look at the kind of effects of Brexit and the causal reasons that led us to the path that we are now. But these things are complicated, and as I say, I don't think it's right to sort of second guess why people voted the way they did. The other thing I'd say about it is that there's a risk of alienation, kind of disenchantment, whichever way you go with this process, I think, because there's also a whole generation of young people who, lots of whom weren't old enough to vote in 2016.
Or were and didn't,
potentially as well, who, young people are overwhelmingly, again, in favour of people's vote, and overwhelmingly, young people voted 75% to remain in the referendum. And there's a whole generation of young people, either the ones who voted Remain and now are faced with a kind of future of Brexit, or who didn't vote, or who were too young to vote at the time, who feel like their voices have been lost in this whole debate as well, because they're seeing rights and opportunities that their parents and their, in some cases their grandparents took for granted.
Or even older brothers,
or even older siblings, or other members of their family, whoever it might be. Rights that those people took for granted, prosperity that those people took for granted, being taken away from them. I mean, we part of the People's Vote campaign is two brilliant campaigns led by young people. One called Our Future, Our Choice, and one called For Our Future's Sake. Hilariously acronymed OFUC and FFS.
Oh man, that is amazing.
Yeah, follow them on Twitter. They're brilliant.
We'll put the links in the description for them both.
But they're brilliant, and they that if you talk to them, you really get a sense of how frustrated they feel that their voice seems to have been lost in this debate as well. So whilst I don't necessarily disagree with your kind of starting assertion, I think it's important not to forget that what we're going through right now is a kind of a possibly the largest thing, or arguably the largest event that's happened in this country since the Second World War. Certainly it's something that's going to be looked back on historically as a kind of as a thing, whichever way it goes, right?
Well, I do not envy those kids sitting GCSE politics being like,
multiple
explain
choice
the reasons for Brexit.
Yeah, exactly.
Or are they going to be sitting in a sunny post-Brexit future, or scrolling with the one pen?
Hopefully, it'll be something like answer why the People's Vote campaign was such a successful movement. That's my personal hope. Exam question, but
30 marks.
Yeah, exactly. I can tell my kids about that one. But yeah, I mean, so I think that's a crucial thing to remember as well, that there's a whole generation of young people there who they want to make sure. I mean, look, whichever way this way goes, I'm not trying to. I mean, it's obvious where my sympathies lie, I think, from everything that has been discussed. I'm never going to think that Brexit is a good idea. I'm never going to kind of think that leaving the European Union is the right thing to do. I think I'm entitled to that opinion.
I'd say, well, in its current state, I'd probably agree with you, but you never know what they're going to.
Yeah, of course, you never know. But I kind of think that
we have a veto for that reason.
Yeah, based on my sort of fundamental values, my view on it is that it's the wrong path, and I don't see any prospect for me to change that view personally. I mean, I don't, without wanting to sort of predict what's going to happen in the future, because I can't. But sadly, but But I think that we do have to kind of remember how significant everything that's happening at the moment is. And I think it's easy to try and, we have a lot of attempts to kind of shut us down and kind of attempts to sort of, I wouldn't say if I was to say silence us, but certainly to kind of downplay the concerns that we raise around Brexit by saying, oh, well, wouldn't this just be betraying the will of 17.4 million people who vote for Brexit? Well, first of all, I think it's a ridiculous premise to try and imply that exactly what every single one of those 17.4 million people voted for. I've just said at the beginning of this that I never seek to do that because it's absolutely impossible. Just I'd never try and say exactly why 16 odd million people voted to remain. Everybody has their different reasons for doing things, and that's why that's why I find this will of the people rhetoric around Brexit so kind of obviously ridiculous, because we don't know why everybody voted the way they did. We know that more people voted to leave than voted to remain. We can say that. But to try and say as a result of that we know exactly what they thought Brexit was going to look like, that they knew with 100% clarity where we were going to end up at the end of this process, I think it's just quite obviously absurd. And that's why I think it's absolutely the right and democratic thing to do, to actually look at the terms on which this massive project is being delivered and ask the people of this country whether or not they think it's good enough, whether or not they agree. And if they, another thing that we get that gets said to us a lot is, oh, well, if this one doesn't go the way you wanted, are you going to just call for a third referendum, fourth referendum, and all the rest of it?
Someone actually pointed out very astutely to me that technically, if you're going to call it a second referendum, it's a third referendum.
Yeah, well, that has been suggested to me as a talking point before. But my view on it is that obviously not. I think if we get to the point, which I hope we do, where we secure people's vote on the deal, and if in that circumstance the people of this country vote for example, for Theresa May's vision of Brexit, whatever that ends up looking like, then I think that's pretty clear that's the direction people want to go in. And I as I said to you before, I wouldn't start thinking that suddenly it was a great idea, but I certainly wouldn't be the one kind of campaigning to sort of to overthrow that. I don't think, because I think that would be wrong. But I don't think it's right to say that that to actually check the terms on which Brexit is being delivered is I see that as absolutely the right thing to do. Like if you put a bid in on a house, and then you find out, through the survey process and everything else, that the foundations are rotten and it's got a problem with mold, and like the basement's
the architect flooded. Was telling you had loads of plans.
And he was telling you that actually it was like it was this amazing palace that they built for you, and then you turn up and it's like one of the ceilings has collapsed or something. And you're not obliged to then say, oh well, I've put my offer down now, so I've got to pay the money over regardless. And I think
no house is better than a bad house.
Well, but that's part of the problem as well, isn't it? Because what we're being faced with here is a prospect where we've been told that we've moved out of our house, put an offer in on a new house that we were promised was amazing, was like this big palatial estate. At this stage, we're looking at this promised palatial estate, and it's actually a rundown shed at the bottom of the garden. But we're told, well, you've moved out of your old house. You've decided to move out of your old house now, so it's too late. You've just got to suck it up and live in your shed now.
I've got visions of that Simpsons scene where Homer has to build the barbecue. Exactly. It's like,
so close.
Why doesn't mine look like that?
Well, yeah. I think even he arguably did a better job of putting together that than the government's doing of putting together this Brexit negotiations. But
he went for it. He just started sticking things.
At least he had a vision.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the sort of analogy I see, because it's not like, that's the other thing that gets thrown around a lot. It's like, oh, well, isn't no deal just like if you're going to buy something, you always have to keep the option to walk away on the table? That's true if saying walking away means a reversion to the status quo, i.e. if I've said I'm going to buy this new house, but then when it doesn't work out, I can then move back into my old house because it didn't work out. It's not saying I've moved out of my old house, it didn't work out with this new house, so now I have to live under a bridge. Like, I think that increasingly I think that the Democratic argument in favour of a people's vote is absolutely overwhelming from my own point of view, and I think that's part of the reason why it's seeing growing support, because it's very, you can see how straightforward it is to make the case why it makes sense to actually look at the terms of Brexit, match them up to what was promised. I mean, I'm not going to, sort of getting towards the end of it now, so I don't want to go into every single broken Brexit promise that people have seen, because we'll be here all day, exactly. But
to be fair, we could probably be here all day listing things that George Osborne said would happen that didn't. Because he said there'd be an emergency Brexit budget and then he resigned.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to argue that the referendum campaign was the sort of finest moment in British political history. But I think the Leave side won the referendum, so it's incumbent upon them to deliver on promises that they made to people. They promised people £350 million extra to the NHS. They promised people that we'd have new trade deals around the world to roll in immediately. I've got one of my favourite YouTube clips of David Davis, which is how sad my life is. I spend watching YouTube clips of David Davis, but claiming that that we're going to have a free trade area 10 times the size of the EU, ready to roll in literally the moment after we leave.
What was he thinking? TTIP?
He was basically thinking that he said Liam Fox is going to go out and strike trade deals with everybody. Therefore, we'd be immediately walking into a free trade area 10 times. I can show you the clip if you want.
Send me it. We'll put a link in.
Yeah, I'll send you it over. It's worth a laugh. So
my favourite one is, we've got a plan, but it's so secret and it's so, inherent to national security that we don't say the plan because it'll ruin our negotiating. I yearn for the days when we had a plan, but it was just secret.
Yeah. Well, what was the one? There was a good one where he was at the select committee and they were kind of asking him about all these impact assessments, and he was like, "Have you done one on aerospace? No. Automotives? No. I'm going to stop you there. The answer is no." Which just tells us sort of the level of planning that's gone into this.
There's some, I cannot for the life of me remember the figure right now, but there is such a tiny minority of people who have access to the impact papers that have actually gone to see them. It's something like 3 or 4% of people who actually have access to it have gone to see it.
Yeah, but part of the reason is that they hid it away in a private reading room that, you have to sign up to get into. You're not allowed to take any notes when you're there, and also it was stuff that was actually leaked a few weeks before they published them. So whilst that's obviously a bit of an indictment of people's kind of willingness to look at the detail, I think there are other reasons for that as well. But anyway, back to the sort of point. There was a huge number of promises that people made about Brexit, none of which have been delivered as far as I can tell. People can see that. People are quite aware of the fact that this idea that there's going to be any extra money for the NHS after Brexit seems to be sort of pie in the sky. That there's no.
Well, I think they'll give them extra money, right? The problem is that money's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. It's
not. We're going to be looking at a budget shortfall, so they're going to have to borrow for it. If that's what they're going to do, fine.
But the promise they made was very clear. It was the money we send to the EU as budget contributions can be spent on the NHS instead, and it's already been demonstrated that almost the entire EU budget contribution that we make at the moment is going to be taken up, certainly for the transition period, because we'll be paying the same amount in, and then for the foreseeable future, either through continuing the payments that we already choose to make, so continuing subsidy payments to farmers, for example, and things like that, or contributions that we've signed up to as part of this £40 billion sort of divorce bill, which seems to me and I think most people kind of paying £40 billion for a shitter relationship with the EU than the one we have already. Again, something that wasn't really mentioned. I don't remember that on the side of any buses.
No. I have got to give, right, like if you put your moral hat aside for a minute, the bus was brilliant. It was genius. Like that was like I don't know who came up with that, and I
think it was Don Cummings.
Really, that would make sense. Yeah. He's a smart guy, but like that just. It dominated everything, and it wasn't about whether the figure was true or not. It's the fact that people were suddenly talking about how much money we send to the EU, and whether that's worth it or not. You can have your own opinion on that, but what it did was really focus people in on how much we send to the EU.
What they did very effectively was start a fight about it. So they plastered it on the side of a bus, And it was clearly a hugely misleading figure because
it's the gross figure.
Yeah, it's the gross figure. So we have a budget rebate, we get money back. And anyway, it was ridiculous to suggest that all of that money would be going on the NHS anyway. But you're right in a sense in that what they did manage to do very successfully was start a big fight about that, which meant that everybody was talking about it. And if you do any focus groups of people from like what they remember from the referendum campaign, that is the thing that almost everybody says. They say, oh, that big bus with the money on the side of it for the NHS. So, it's hard to argue that it had an insane amount of cut through. But it was also a promise that they should be held to. And if they can't deliver on it, then people have a right to say, well, hold on a minute. Is this Brexit that's being delivered to me the one that was actually promised? And I think that's another part of the argument in favour of people's vote is almost, as I said, almost none of those promises are materialising. There's no sign of any new free trade deals. I mean, the only prospect of any trade deals at all that Liam Fox is bragging about is that he might maybe be able to roll over the existing ones that we have with the EU, maybe. But even that looks likely to be a more difficult process than he's setting out. So what you're actually ending up with is a country that's going to be left worse off than we are now, with no extra money for the NHS. In fact, a diminished NHS, because, as you say, even if they, come up with some new funding pledge for the NHS, that money's got to come from somewhere, and it's certainly not from.
Yes, they pledged money.
They pledged 20 billion to the NHS, but they claim that some of that money will be from
it's their Brexit
inverted
dividend.
commas Brexit dividend, although that's been sort of debunked. I mean, it might be possible that they find, they can say like this particular £1 coin that we're sending to the NHS is from the money that we might otherwise send to the EU. But the wider point is that we know that our economy is going to be smaller as a result of the Brexit path that they're pursuing, which means less money for the NHS, and also means that things like EU staff in the NHS is taking a big hit. There's loads of stats about how many EU nurses have left the NHS or aren't coming to the NHS to work in the NHS since Brexit. There's a chart I can probably send you to people that just shows it flatlining basically after 2016 and no sign of it recovering.
No, it's not just the European nurses. There was like a program to recruit 3,000 new midwives, and they got like 20.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Nursing, and the British Medical Association, so the NHS unions representing nursing, midwifery, and doctors, have all voted to support a people's vote as well, which I think shows how serious the risk is within the NHS of Brexit and of a bad Brexit deal. So that's something that we're really
ultimately people who work in medicine, like their priority is like their patients. Like I never cease to be amazed at the amount of work and the amount of shit that friends of mine who are nurses put up with. My mum's a nurse, and I know all her friends, and they are constantly bitching about the shit they have to put up with, and that like they're understaffed and overmanaged, and they go in every day and they do their very utmost to help their patients. So
my cousin's a doctor as well as specializes in geriatrics, and you're like, what they want is to be able to deliver a good service to their patients. Anything that makes that more difficult is a serious problem for them. And I think all of the evidence suggests that Brexit is going to be possibly the biggest problem for them going forward, because you go into any hospital, go into any GP surgery, you'll see staff from the EU, you'll see international staff, see nurses from Italy, Spain, Portugal, whatever. They're a very significant, and we don't train enough nurses as it is in this country, or doctors as it is. So taking a hit to that from making it more difficult for EU staff to come here is just complete craziness. I think most people view it that way, and again, that's part of the reason why it's kind of, I think why people are coming around to the idea of people's vote is because they were promised it. Part of the reason that they were promised, part of the promises that they were made as part of Brexit were that the NHS would be stronger as a result, and it looks increasingly like Brexit is going to make the NHS much weaker. So I think that's a big part of it as well, and that is something that everybody has a stake in.
See,
yeah, exactly.
Well, I have got to shoot on, and I have taken up enough of your time as well.
No problem, my pleasure.
Yeah, it was great.
Good to talk to you.
I could chat about this all day, speculate, and
I do chat about it all day.
Yeah, it's your job. But yeah, thanks very much for chatting to us. It was a lot of fun, and we'll have all the things we talked about in the description. And yeah, thanks very much.
No problem.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our next episode is out Tuesday with Jackson Rawlings from The Politicalists. So don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss that. Till next time, thanks for listening.